lot of the passion that a lot of the individuals in here have had. One of the things that excites us so much about the India market is all the things that are going on here. One of the observations that I had as I was sitting listening was as though every institution in here probably has their own mission about what their institution is really all about. There was a lot of conversation about sort of a research mission. Other institutions may have a much more sort of teaching focused mission for their institution. But as campus management and as chief strategy officer, a couple of the things that I find interesting about this particular market is the degree of change that's occurring in an industry that probably isn't known for having a lot of innovation and change. And it kind of reminded me of a story that I wanted to open with about an athlete that was a U.S. athlete, Mark Spitz, that back in the 1972 Olympics set world records in 7 different events that he participated in the Olympics. And if you look ahead to kind of where that stood a number of years later, his times that he set world records at that moment wouldn't have even qualified him to be in the finals of the events. And it kind of points out the fact that we're constantly having to evolve and get better, and from the perspective of the things that we used to do yesterday that make us successful, you can't rest on your laurels, and you have a lot of reason then why you need to continue to evolve. When we look at kind of the things that are going on and a lot of the conversation here in this audience about the factors that are influencing higher education, we've talked about that as being the superstorm, and there's really sort of 4 areas that we've put that into, and keeping in mind that we're thinking about the systems then that are needed to be in place to help run an institution effectively and make those institutions the most productive they can be. And there are really changes in the delivery models that are occurring within higher ed, and a lot of the advances that are going on about how higher education is delivered, both in the classroom as well as the opportunities that are being influenced as a result online with the use of online technologies. And it's not just MOOCs, right? That's one area where there's an change in the delivery models, but it's much more pervasive than that in terms of how different programs are being constructed and how students are able to then learn. The other aspect of this is the changes in competition. The marketplace is really being opened up as a result of technology in terms of, who do I compete with and what's the peer set, the peer group that I compete against that is being influenced also as a result of changes in technology. The realities of students to be able to get access to education is being influenced by technology. It's also being influenced by the fact that there's much more competition for the best students amongst institutions. There's a lot of changes going on from a government perspective. We talked about just in this session about the changes that the Indian government is looking to help move forward. And as we've seen in the U.S. and other changes, other places, those can be disruptive factors. And again, sort of where you stood before, it can have impacts into the systems that are needed to make those institutions effective from a governance and compliance perspective. And then lastly is the conversation that's going on around outcomes. And you can view outcomes from a number of different perspectives, right? One of them is the ability of my students that I'm coming into the classroom to be successful in the classroom and actually graduate. Another aspect of that would be, we need to get better microphones, is the placement side of that, right? Which is the ability of the graduates that I'm conferring a degree to actually be able to get a job. And so there's a lot of conversation in this room that's gone on about that. There's a ton of conversation that's gone on in other areas, like in the United States. 25 of the 50 states have actually enacted legislation that now tie outcomes and funding together. Just this morning I was looking at pieces that were coming in from the U.S. regarding Lamar Alexander, who's the chairman of the Senate Committee for the Department of Education, about rewriting the Education Act in the United States. And a lot of it is focused around accountability of the institutions for achieving outcomes. So all four of these factors are major disruptors that are happening within higher education that are impacting the systems that are necessary to operate it. And the last piece that's on this one chart is just the fundamental generational shift that's occurring that makes today's inbound prospective students very different from the same student 25 years ago, and how technology is impacting them as well. So I'm going to cover just a couple things. I'm not going to go through some of the slides I was going to do in the interest of brevity, but one of the aspects of that generational shift is just the technological age that we currently live within. There's always been an internet. If you're an inbound student today, didn't exist. Your entire life experience is changed by that. If you want to know something, you don't really go to the library, you just Google it. And today's prospective inbound students, by and large, are very comfortable with the idea of technology. In the United States, many of the kids in school are issued tablets, and as part of the core foundation of their educational experience. And you can go to a high school and show them a Yellow Pages, which used to be prevalent, and they can't even identify what it is because they've never seen one and they've never used it. If you look on to a couple of other things that I just, the company I worked for before campus management was Google, and just from the perspective of, again, where technology is impacting us, Eric Schmidt talked about the next 5 billion users, and the fact that internet technology is becoming pervasive, and it's really becoming an age where accessibility to information and accessibility to things like the MOOCs that we talked about earlier is radically changing people's access. The interesting thing, though, is that that's not the whole story, because education is not just about access to a body of knowledge, right? It's about how do I develop critical thinking skills. My own educational experience, I think, one of those things that it was shaped by was, I was given a problem for which I was given solutions. When I did an examination, it was go find the solution or the answer that's already known, versus the problem in business that typically is, I'm giving a problem for which there are no known answers. The other thing that we've seen from a global trends perspective is redefining the customer. One of the things is, in a setting of higher education institutions, even the mere mention of the fact that there's a customer might be, heresy, because, in academics we shouldn't talk about such things as the fact that there actually is a customer, and to the extent that we could discuss the fact that there was one, the first place that we probably thought of the customer as being is their own faculty and staff. There's been an evolving movement to thinking about the student, potentially their family, who are actually sponsoring their attendance at that institution. There was some mention of the cultural impacts of how that selection is actually made in terms of what institution they attend. But the evolving thing that I've seen more and more is the notion that the employer is really the ultimate customer. And the students that the institutions are making, for all practical purposes, are really the product. I also kind of, though, chuckled a little bit, which was the conversation went on about, how do we tie to industry? Because I'm not sure that you can necessarily go to businesses and get them to tell you exactly what it is that you need to produce. A couple of other trends in higher education that we've seen is, in the future, is really, the ability to take a course as a service. So, there's a lot of things that everything now is as a service, right? Software as a service, infrastructure as a service. Well, if you put that in the higher ed context, there's really kind of three things that we've seen. One is there's the idea of a course as a service. The second piece is there's education as a service, my ability to get a diploma, or hybrid learning, online learning. The final piece is a degree as a service. And this is really where I can take together and can create my own degree from a number of different sources. And things that are needed for that, though, are things like credit portability and competency-based learning. Some other things that we've looked at is just from the perspective of global trends, and we've seen across a number of institutions, is that most of them are implementing their playbook. They're defining their processes so that they can institutionalize, when this happens, I do this. And it allows their people and their managers then to be focused on the problems that they're trying to solve and those strategies, rather than having to manage the day-to-day activities, because they're relying upon systems to institutionalize the things that they need to accomplish. A couple of things that I just wanted to highlight from a couple of examples. This one's Penn State University. So I sat on a panel recently with some people from Penn State. There were a couple of things that I thought that were very interesting that they pointed out, besides the fact that they were a customer of ours. One is that less than 20%, or only about 20%, 1 in 5 of their students today fit the definition that they had 20 years ago of what even constituted a traditional student. So in other words, the vast majority of their students aren't even the people that today we think of as coming into that institution, moving into the dorm, living on campus, going through a standard 4-year experience. And this is a highly regarded Research One institution in the United States. The other thing that's interesting is that over half their students now take at least one online course as part of their curriculum. And that's obviously something that used to be zero not that long ago, and they're projecting that that's going to continue to rapidly grow. Another couple of things that we've seen on that, just relative to kind of what other institutions are doing. We've seen a number of private institutions dramatically grow their businesses online. One of them is Grand Canyon, that was founded in 1949, was hovering about 5,000 students for pretty much forever, and then exploded with their online programs. Actually, the interesting thing is Grand Canyon would say, when I asked them what's the key to their success, they said they're on their campuses. And I'm like, but all your growth was online. They said, yeah, but the ability of our students to come in and feel like they've got that connection to that ground campus was actually their biggest strength. Another one is Ashford University, which grew from like 500 students to almost 70,000. I'm going to try to cut through a couple of these things because I know that we're running over. When you kind of think about higher education from a capabilities maturity model, and particularly the administrative systems that need to be engaged, there was a lot of conversation here about rankings. And there's obviously a number of different rankings sources, right? And a lot of them are heavily weighted towards research institutions. The U.S. News and World Report, one that is predominantly used in the United States, isn't quite so heavily weighted towards research, but it tends to be based on your history. And there's a great deal of inertia that's happening. But if you kind of go back to those superstorm factors, that's what's fundamentally changing higher education, right? And is providing the backdrop for which there is disruption that can occur. From a growth perspective, it's really about expanding the applicant pool, and from an efficiency perspective, it's all about compliance. And if you kind of begin to move from the technical to strategic to transformational, you can kind of look at this chart and see where, from a rankings perspective, and particularly the rankings that aren't just research-based, because that's just about, plowing your money in, getting your citations done, which doesn't mean that those are easy. But if you think about kind of the academic reputation, some of the things that allowed some of the mix-up in the MBA program rankings recently was the result of employer feedback about the quality of the graduates that they were receiving. And that was the biggest factor in changing some of the recent rankings that came out. If you transform your students into people that are sought after, you're likely to change your outcomes. And from a growth perspective, there's obviously a tremendous opportunity to leverage the assets that you have in terms of how do you change what you're able to deliver. One of the interesting things, again, from the Penn State example was, they had their World Campus Initiative. One of the things that they actually learned from their online experience was getting back to the roots of how students learn. And coming back to the whole concept of some of the flipped classrooms and some of this has actually been as a result of having to become much more engaged with the student as part of the learning process and learning to be teachers again. And from an efficiency perspective, really being able to learn to adapt your institution as these transformational changes continue. So anyway, without too much fanfare, what we would contend is that you can sort of set aside these elite institutions, whether in India it's the IITs or in the United States, the Harvards, the Yales, and the whatever, right? They're probably immune to a lot of the influences going on. But for the vast majority of the numbers of institutions, the ability to change this means that they have to change or they're going to go out of business effectively. Surprisingly, in the United States, if you've been reading the press there recently, a surprising number of institutions are doing just that. They're closing their doors because the changes going on are effectively putting them out of business. And we're seeing unprecedented amounts of influences in higher education, which are providing a backdrop for institutions really to shake up where they stand relative to one another. We kind of talk about this as being our overall mission to serve the on-demand era that effectively that we're moving into, that fundamentally shifts what being a higher education institution tomorrow will really mean. And I think with that, I'm going to, conclude my opening remarks.